On the night of January 13th, 2012, a ship worth $570 million turned towards shallow water. The captain had left the bridge. 4,252 people were spread across 17 decks. Most were eating dinner. Some were watching a theater production that would never finish. Within 90 minutes, the vessel would be on its side, half submerged, 300 meters from an island that had never seen a disaster of this scale. The ship was the Costa Concordia, the most ambitious cruise liner Italy had ever launched. 290 meters of marble atriums, 5 restaurants, 13 bars, and 4 swimming pools. It was designed to be unsinkable. This is the dark story of Italy's most ambitious ship, Costa Concordia. We're going to cover everything: the vessel's creation and the staggering luxury aboard, the culture that shaped its command, the decisions made in darkness, the hours that followed, the voices that were ignored, the salvage operation that had never been attempted at this scale, and the question that has never been fully answered. 32 people died that night. Thousands more barely escaped. So, was this the failure of one man, or something far larger that the industry has yet to confront? The Costa Concordia was delivered to her owners in July of 2006. She was registered in Genoa, flew the Italian flag, and measured 290.2 meters from bow to stern. That number, 290 meters, deserves pause. Stand at one end of this vessel, and you could not clearly see a person waving at the other. She displaced 114,000 metric tons when fully loaded. 17 decks rose above her keel. 13 of those decks carried passengers. The ship could berth 4,252 souls, 3,216 passengers, and 1,036 crew. She was not the largest cruise ship in the world in 2006, but she was close. She was certainly the largest thing Costa Crociere, the Italian cruise line, had ever built. And Costa Crociere, itself owned by Carnival Corporation, the American behemoth of leisure maritime travel, wanted the world to know it. The Concordia belonged to a class of ships called Concordia class. She was the lead vessel. Her sisters, Costa Serena, Costa Pacifica, Costa Favolosa, Costa Fascinosa, would follow in the years after. Each weighed over 100,000 tons. Each carried the same DNA of excess. But Concordia was first, and in maritime culture, the first of a class holds a kind of pride. Her name meant harmony, unity, peace. It was taken from the motto of the European Union. Her interior designers took that theme seriously. Each of the 13 passenger decks was named after a European nation. Deck 3, Germania. Deck 4, Francia. Deck 5, Portofino, Italia, Venetia, and so on upward. The idea was that a passenger walking through the ship would walk through a miniature Europe, each level decorated in supposed tribute to that country's aesthetic. The execution was less homage, more theme park, but it sold tickets. The ship's centerpiece was an atrium called the Capitol. It rose through 9 decks, a vertical shaft of marble, glass, and steel. 2 grand staircases spiraled upward on either side. 4 panoramic glass elevators glided silently up and down the atrium's height, offering passengers a view of other passengers below, a kind of human aquarium. The floor of the Capitol was Italian marble, white with grey veins. The ceiling, 9 stories above, was a skylight of reinforced glass. At night, lighting designers bathed the atrium in amber and violet. During the day, sunlight filtered down, and the atrium became the gathering point, the heart, the symbolic center of life aboard. Passengers took photographs there. Children ran across the marble. It was beautiful in the way only expensive things trying very hard to be beautiful can be. The Concordia had 5 full-service restaurants. The largest, the Samsara restaurant, seated over 1,000 guests. There was the Milano restaurant, serving northern Italian cuisine on fine china. A pizzeria, because no Italian-flagged vessel could sail without one. A specialty steakhouse. A sushi bar. 13 bars were scattered across the decks. There was a cognac and cigar lounge, wood-paneled, leather-chaired, designed for men who wanted to feel like railroad barons. A coffee bar serving espresso in small ceramic cups. A champagne bar. A sports bar with large screens showing football matches. 4 swimming pools, 2 of which had retractable glass roofs, meaning passengers could swim in January in the Mediterranean and not freeze. The ship carried enough chlorine and filtration equipment to operate a municipal water park. The spa was called Samsara Spa. It occupied 2 decks and covered 6,000 square meters. 6,000? That is larger than many community hospitals. It contained saunas, Turkish baths, a thalassotherapy pool, which is seawater heated and circulated for therapeutic bathing. There were treatment rooms for massage, hydrotherapy, mud wraps, facials, a full gymnasium with treadmills, elliptical machines, free weights, and personal trainers on staff. The spa employed 43 people. Passengers could book packages, 3 massages, a seaweed wrap, and unlimited sauna access for the week. It cost extra. Of course, everything beyond the base fare cost extra. The main theater, Teatro Concordia, had 1,500 seats arranged across 3 levels. It staged Broadway-style productions every evening of every voyage. Singers, dancers, a live orchestra in the pit. Costumes were stored in a dedicated wardrobe room spanning 200 square meters. The technical crew for the theater alone numbered 18. Lighting rigs, hydraulic stage lifts, fog machines, pyrotechnics for certain numbers. It was a theater that happened to float. In the daytime, when no show was running, the theater was used for bingo, guest lectures, and religious services on Sundays. There was a casino, of course, slot machines, blackjack tables, roulette, poker. It occupied a prime location on Deck 4, windowless and loud with the electronic noise of gambling. The casino was exempt from Italian gambling laws, while the ship was in international waters, which it was most of the time. Revenue from the casino was significant. Carnival Corporation does not publish per-ship gambling income, but industry estimates suggest a vessel this size could generate $2 to $3 million annually from casino operations alone. The house always wins, even at sea. Especially at sea, where passengers have nowhere else to spend. A discotheque occupied the forward section of Deck 7. It was called the Grand Bar Palatino. Mirrored walls, LED lighting that changed color in sync with the music, a DJ booth elevated above the dance floor. It opened at 11 p.m. and closed when the last passenger left, sometimes 4 or 5 in the morning. The floor was sprung hardwood, designed to absorb the impact of dancing. The sound system cost €250,000. On formal nights, it transformed into a ballroom. On party nights, it was a nightclub that would not have been out of place in Milan. For children, there was a water park on the upper deck, slides, splash pools, a pirate ship structure for climbing, a dedicated kids club with activities, arts and crafts, video game consoles. Teenagers had their own lounge with air hockey, foosball, and a cinema room. The ship carried 3 professional youth counselors per voyage. Babysitting services were available for a fee. The Concordia was designed so that parents could deposit their children and then disappear into the spa or casino for hours without guilt. 505 cabins had private balconies. Balconies on a cruise ship are a luxury upcharge. The cheapest interior cabin, no window, barely room to turn around, might cost €800 for the week. A balcony suite on an upper deck could run $4,000. People paid it. The balconies were narrow, just wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table, but they offered private access to the sea air and the view. At night, passengers would stand on their balconies with a glass of wine and watch the coastline slide past, lit by small towns on distant hills. It felt, they said, romantic. It felt like wealth. The crew lived differently. 1,036 crew members staffed the Concordia. They came from 60 nations: Filipinos, Indonesians, Indians, Eastern Europeans, South Americans, Italians, a few British officers. They worked contracts of 6 to 9 months, then rotated off for leave. Their cabins were below the waterline, small, shared, 2 or 3 to a room. Bunk beds. A single bathroom shared among 4 cabins. No windows, no balconies. The crew dining hall served meals in shifts, efficient and plain. Rice, beans, chicken, vegetables. The passengers ate lobster. The crew ate what was economical. This is the arithmetic of the cruise industry. 1,036 people work so that 3,216 people can forget they are being worked for. The Concordia cost approximately $570 million to construct. She was built at the Fincantieri shipyard in Genoa, one of the largest shipyards in Europe. Construction began in 2004. 1,500 workers were employed on the build at peak. The steel alone weighed over 20,000 tons. 36,000 cubic meters of concrete were poured for stability and structure. 8 engines, each the size of a small bus, generated 82,000 kilowatts of power. The ship burned 250 tons of fuel per day at cruising speed. Fuel cost fluctuated, but at 2012 prices, that was roughly 70,000 euros in fuel per day, 490,000 euros per week. A single voyage consumed enough diesel to fill 300 family cars for a year. The ship was profitable, of course. Carnival Corporation does not build unprofitable ships. At average occupancy, the Concordia grossed roughly 6 million euros per week. Ticket sales, bar tabs, casino, shore excursions, spa treatments, photo packages, specialty dining. A passenger might pay 2,000 euros for a balcony cabin, but spend another 800 over the course of the week on extras. Multiply that by 3,000 passengers. The ship paid for herself within 4 years. After that, she was profit with engines. Costa Crociere marketed the Concordia as the pinnacle of Italian elegance at sea. Brochures showed sunlit decks, smiling families, women in white linen walking the promenade with cocktails. The tagline, in English and Italian, was "Italy's finest." The ship sailed the Mediterranean year-round, 7-day loops, Civitavecchia to Savona, to Marseille, to Barcelona, to Palma de Mallorca, to Cagliari, to Palermo and back. In summer, she sometimes ventured east, Athens and the Greek Isles. In winter, she stayed closer to the Italian coast. The clientele was heavily European, especially Italian and French. Families, retirees, honeymooners. People for whom a week on a floating resort was the annual highlight. The thing saved 4. Captain Francesco Schettino took command of the Concordia in 2006, the year she launched. He was 52 years old in January 2012. He had been a merchant marine officer for over 20 years. He held a master's license. He had commanded several costa vessels before the Concordia. By all official measures, he was qualified. He was also, by multiple accounts from crew who served under him, arrogant. He liked to showboat. He liked to bring the ship close to shore during sailaways so passengers could wave to people on land. He liked to perform what are called salutes, unofficial maneuvers where a ship passes close to a coastal town, sounds its horn, and the town's residents come out to watch. It was theater. It was also, technically, a deviation from approved routing, which required approval from company headquarters. Schettino did not always seek approval. On January 13, 2012, the Concordia departed Civitavecchia, the port near Rome, at 7:30 p.m. It was a Friday. The ship was full. 3,216 passengers, 1,027 crew. 13 fewer crew than standard. Some positions were unfilled due to holiday scheduling. It was the first leg of a 7-day itinerary. The weather was calm, overcast, cool, but no wind. The sea was classified as calm, wave height under 0.5 meter. Ideal conditions. Passengers boarded throughout the afternoon. The embarkation process was industrial. Luggage scanned. Boarding cards issued. Photo taken for the ship's ID system. A brief walkthrough of muster station locations, though the actual lifeboat drill would not occur until the following day. This was standard practice in 2012. Passengers were told where their lifeboat stations were, shown a safety video in their cabins, but the physical muster drill, where everyone goes to their station and practices, was scheduled for the afternoon of January 14th. The logic was that passengers wanted to enjoy their first evening, not stand on deck in life jackets. The industry had decided convenience outweighed caution. That logic would be revisited after this voyage. By the time the ship cast off and began moving out of the harbor at Civitavecchia, most passengers were exploring. The atrium was full. Families took photos under the skylight. Teenagers found the pizza bar. Couples walked the open promenade deck, watching the Italian coast recede. Dinner service began at 8. The main dining rooms filled. Waiters in white jackets served bread, poured wine, presented menus. The first night's menu was always Italian. Antipasti, pasta, veal, tiramisu. It was Friday the 13th, and some passengers joked about it, made mock superstitious gestures, knocked on wood. The crew smiled politely. They had heard it before. In the spa, evening yoga classes were underway. In the casino, the first slot machines jingled to life. In the theater, technicians were preparing for the 9:15 show, a revue called Concordia Fantasy. Costumes hung on racks backstage. The orchestra was warming up. In the cabins, passengers unpacked, showered, changed for dinner. Children ran down carpeted hallways, excited, freed from parental oversight by the sheer size of the ship. The Concordia's interior was a maze. Corridors identical, staircases spiraling, deck numbers in brushed steel on the walls every few meters so you could remember where you were. New passengers got lost routinely. The crew knew every passage, every shortcut, every crew-only door that led behind the scenes. Below, in the engine rooms, the 8 diesel engines thrummed. Engineers monitored temperatures, pressures, fuel flow. The bridge, on deck 16, was calm. Officers stood watch. Navigation screens glowed green and blue. The ship's route was plotted electronically. Autopilot was engaged. The officer of the watch checked radar, confirmed no traffic nearby. Captain Schettino was not on the bridge. He was expected later. For now, the ship drove herself, her computers following a path programmed before departure. She would sail north along the coast, then turn west overnight, heading toward Savona. Routine. But at some point that evening, a decision was made. The exact moment is unclear. Schettino later claimed it was a spontaneous choice. Others suggested it had been planned. The decision was this. The Concordia would deviate from her programmed course. She would sail close to the island of Giglio, a small, rocky island off the Tuscan coast. She would perform a salute. The horn would sound. Passengers would rush to the railings. The island's residents would see the great ship pass. It was spectacle. It was brand marketing. It was also dangerous. Giglio is not large, roughly 14 square kilometers, 1,200 permanent residents. Rocky coastline, steep hills, a small harbor on the eastern side. The western side, where the Concordia would approach, is jagged. Reefs extend underwater, some charted, some not. The water is shallow in places, deep in others. Ships are supposed to stay well offshore. The approved route passed Giglio at a distance of over 5 nautical miles. Schettino intended to pass at 300 meters. 300 meters. The length of the ship herself. There is a reef off Giglio's western coast called Le Scole. It consists of submerged rocks, granite, volcanic stone. At low tide, some of the rocks break the surface. At high tide, they lurk just beneath. The reef is charted on navigational maps. It is marked with a warning symbol. Ships are instructed to avoid it. On the evening of January 13th, the tide was neither high nor low. The rocks of Lascaux sat between 1 and 4 meters below the surface. The Concordia drew 7.8 meters, fully loaded. That means the bottom of her hull was 7.8 meters below the waterline. For the ship to pass over Lascaux without striking, she would need at least 8 meters of clearance, ideally more. She would not have it. Schettino returned to the bridge around 9:30 p.m. He took direct control from the officer of the watch. He disengaged the autopilot. He turned the ship toward Giglio. The officers on the bridge, the helmsman, the navigator, the officer of the watch, they knew what was happening. Some had sailed with Schettino before. They had done salutes before. No one objected. This is a recurring theme in maritime disasters. The captain is God. The bridge crew, even if they see danger, often stay silent. Chain of command becomes chain of complicity. Passengers eating dinner on deck 3 noticed nothing. Passengers in the theater, waiting for the show to start, noticed nothing. In cabin 5114, a couple from France stood on their balcony, watching the dark coast. They saw lights from Giglio growing closer. They thought it was beautiful, how close the ship came to land. They took a photograph. That photograph, time-stamped 9:42 p.m., shows the island's lights clearly, too clearly. At 9:45 p.m. and 8 seconds, the Concordia's portside hull made contact with the reef called Lascaux. The ship was traveling at 21.2 kilometers per hour. She weighed 114,000 tons. The rocks did not move. The hull did. The sound was heard throughout the ship, but its meaning was not immediately understood. In the dining room, glasses slid off tables. Plates shattered. Passengers grabbed the edges of their tables. Some thought it was turbulence, a wave. Others thought the ship had hit another ship. In the theater, the stage shook. The orchestra stopped playing. Dancers froze mid-step. In the engine rooms, alarms began to scream. Engineers saw seawater flooding into compartments that should have been dry. Watertight doors, automated, began to slam shut. The ship's hull had been opened along a length of 53 meters. 53 meters. The rocks had unzipped the Concordia like a surgeon's blade, cutting through steel plate, through framing, through compartments. Water entered at a rate of tons per second. The ship lost electrical power within minutes. Generators flooded. Backup systems tried to engage, failed. The lights went out. Emergency lighting, battery-powered, flickered on. It was dim, red, disorienting. The grand atrium, moments before glowing with amber light, went dark. Passengers began to shout. Crew members tried to calm them, but the crew did not yet know what had happened. The ship began to list. Slowly at first, a few degrees, then faster. On the bridge, Schettino and his officers stared at their screens. The electronic chart showed the ship's position overlaid on the reef. It was obvious. They had struck Lascaux. Water was flooding the port side. The ship's stability computer began issuing warnings. Critical list angle approaching. The Concordia was dying, and she was doing it in view of passengers holding dessert forks. Schettino did not immediately order evacuation. He did not immediately sound the general alarm. He called the company, Costa Concordia headquarters. He told them there had been an electrical problem. He downplayed it. The Coast Guard, monitoring radio channels, heard distress chatter from the ship and called the bridge. Schettino told them it was a blackout, under control. It was not under control. The ship continued to list. Passengers, now in life jackets, crowded the decks. Some crew began preparing lifeboats without official orders. They could feel the ship dying under their feet. At 10:54 p.m., over an hour after impact, Schettino gave the order to abandon ship. By then, the Concordia had drifted closer to Giglio's shore and was lying at a 20-degree list. Lifeboats on the port side could not be launched. The angle was too severe. Only the starboard boats were usable. The ship was designed to evacuate 4,000 people using all lifeboats. Now, only half were available. The mathematics of disaster had begun. The hull of a cruise ship is not a single piece of steel. It is a series of compartments, separated by watertight bulkheads, doors that can seal to prevent flooding from spreading. The Concordia had 22 watertight compartments. The theory, inherited from a century of shipbuilding, is that a vessel can lose 1, 2, even 3 compartments and remain afloat. The Titanic was designed to survive 4 flooded compartments. She struck an iceberg that opened 6. The Concordia was designed to survive 3 flooded compartments. The reef opened 5. When the rocks tore through the hull, they did not simply puncture. They scraped along the length of the ship as she continued moving forward. Escatino, realizing too late what was happening, tried to steer away. The gash extended from frame 52 to frame 109, 53 meters of opened steel. It crossed multiple watertight zones. Compartments 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 flooded immediately. Seawater, cold, pressured by the depth and the ship's momentum, poured in at an estimated rate of 80 tons per second in the first 30 seconds. 80 tons. That is the weight of 50 automobiles entering the ship every second. The engine rooms were in the affected zone. Engineers, men from the Philippines, Indonesia, Italy, were at their stations when the water arrived. Some managed to escape through watertight doors before they sealed. Some did not. The doors close automatically when flooding is detected. They are heavy, hydraulic, designed to shut even against resistance. A man caught halfway through can be crushed. At least 2 engineers were trapped below when the doors sealed. They drowned in darkness, in spaces they had worked in every day for months, spaces they knew by touch. Their bodies were recovered weeks later, still in their coveralls. The flooding of the engine rooms killed the ship's propulsion and most of her electrical generation. The Concordia had 8 diesel engines. All 8 were in the now flooded compartments. When seawater meets a running diesel engine, the engine seizes violently. Metal screams. The ship went from 21 kilometers per hour to 0 propulsion in under 3 minutes. She became adrift. 100,000-ton piece of momentum with no ability to steer, no ability to stop. Emergency generators, located higher in the ship, tried to engage. They provided some power, enough for emergency lighting, for critical systems, but not enough for the full hotel load. The restaurants, the elevators, the atrium lights, the theater. The ship went dark. Passengers in the dining rooms experienced this as a sudden lurch, a metallic grinding sound that came from below and seemed to travel through the floor, and then a loss of light. The main dining room on Deck 3, the Milano, had been serving approximately 600 guests when the impact occurred. Waiters carrying trays of tiramisu stumbled. A wine rack mounted on the wall tore free and shattered on the marble floor. Bottles exploded. Red wine spread across white stone like blood. Passengers stood, uncertain. Some moved toward exits. Others remained seated, waiting for an announcement. The ship's public address system crackled to life. A voice, calm, in Italian, and then English, said there had been a technical issue, a generator problem, and crew were working to restore power. Passengers were asked to remain calm and await further instructions. This announcement, later reviewed, was a lie. There was no generator problem. There was a hole in the ship. In the theater, the show had not yet begun. Passengers were seated. The orchestra was in the pit. The curtain was down. When the impact came, the entire stage shifted. Lighting rigs swayed. A dancer backstage fell and fractured her wrist. The stage manager, a Romanian woman who had worked cruise ships for 12 years, immediately knew this was not normal. She had felt rough seas. She had felt docking bumps. She had felt engine vibrations. This was different. She grabbed a radio and called the bridge. No answer. She called the staff captain. No answer. The theater began to tilt, gently, to the right. Passengers noticed their seats were no longer level. Some stood and left. Others waited. The emergency lighting cast everything in red. On the open decks, passengers who had been walking after dinner felt the impact as a shudder and heard the sound of metal dragging on rock, a screech that lasted 5 seconds. Some ran to the railings and looked over the side. In the darkness, they could see nothing, but they could hear water rushing, a sound like a river, which was the sea pouring into the hull. One passenger, a German engineer named Klaus, later described it as the sound of a bathtub filling, but amplified 1,000 times, a roar of water meeting air in enclosed spaces. He knew immediately the ship was flooding. He went to his cabin, retrieved his wife and daughter, put life jackets on them, and returned to the open deck. He did this without waiting for instructions. His training told him that a ship taking on water at that rate had minutes, not hours. He was correct. The list, the tilt of the ship, began almost immediately, but progressed slowly at first. In the first 5 minutes after impact, the list was only 3 degrees. Noticeable if you paid attention, easy to dismiss if you did not. A glass of water on a table would slide slightly. A door left ajar would swing slowly closed. By 9:50 p.m., 5 minutes after impact, the list was 6 degrees. Passengers walking down corridors felt themselves drifting towards the starboard wall. In the casino, slot machines on the port side began to topple. Coins spilled across the carpet. Gamblers, annoyed, then frightened, abandoned their machines and moved toward exits. The casino staff, following protocol, began shutting down the tables, securing chips and cash. One dealer, a young woman from Slovakia, later said she remembered thinking how absurd it was, securing money while the ship was sinking. But protocol is protocol. She locked the cash drawers, then left. The bridge, by 9:50 p.m., was in controlled chaos. Schettino was on the radio with Costa Concordia headquarters in Genoa. He was minimizing. He said the ship had experienced a blackout, possibly struck something, but was stable. He did not use the word sinking. The staff captain, the second in command, was on another radio with the Italian Coast Guard. The Coast Guard station at Livorno had heard reports from passengers using cell phones, calling emergency services, saying the ship was in trouble. The Coast Guard asked directly, "Are you taking on water?" The staff captain hesitated, looked at Schettino, then said yes, some water, but the pumps were handling it. This was also a lie. The pumps were not handling it. The pumps were designed to handle minor leaks, rainwater, ballast adjustments. They were not designed to fight the sea entering through a 53-meter wound. The ship's stability depended on symmetry. Weight on the port side balanced by weight on the starboard. When 5 compartments on the port side filled with water, thousands of tons of weight shifted to one side. The ship began to roll. Naval architects call this a list. It is different from a temporary roll caused by a wave. A list does not correct itself. A list continues until the ship reaches a new equilibrium, or capsizes. The Concordia's list reached 10 degrees by 10 p.m. At 10 degrees, walking becomes difficult. Staircases become ramps. Furniture slides. Elevators, even those still powered by emergency generators, automatically shut down because the tilt exceeds safe operating angles. Passengers who had been in their cabins, changing for the evening show, now found themselves trapped. Elevators were dead. Staircases were crowded with people climbing upward, toward open decks, toward air. Schettino, at some point between 9:50 and 10:15 p.m., made a decision. He attempted to steer the dying ship toward Giglio's shore. The idea, he later claimed, was to beach the vessel, to ground it in shallow water so it would not sink in deep water. The ship had no engine power, but it had residual momentum and a rudder. Using the rudder and the anchor, or perhaps just the drift and the current, Schettino managed to angle the ship towards the island. At 10:03 p.m., the Concordia's starboard side scraped bottom on a rocky shelf near Giglio's harbor. She came to rest in approximately 20 meters of water, her port side in deeper water, her starboard side on the shelf. This grounding may have saved lives. If the ship had sunk in deep water, capsized completely, the death toll would have been catastrophic. But Schettino did not beach the ship intentionally with skill. He aimed a floating wreck at an island and got lucky. By 10:15 p.m., the list was 15 degrees. Passengers on the open decks could see the island, close now, lights from houses visible. Some passengers, panicking, jumped overboard. The water temperature was 14 degrees Celsius, cold enough to incapacitate a swimmer in minutes, to kill in under an hour. Some of those who jumped made it to shore, swimming or clinging to debris. Some did not. A man from France, traveling with his wife, jumped from deck 5. He survived. His wife did not jump. She waited for a lifeboat. She survived. They were reunited on Giglio 3 hours later, both hypothermic, both weeping. The order to abandon ship, the 7 short blasts and 1 long blast on the ship's horn that signals evacuation, was not given until 10:54 p.m., over an hour after impact. In that hour, the ship had gone from a 3-degree list to a 20-degree list. Lifeboats on the port side, now tilted outward over the water, could not be launched. The davits, the mechanical arms that lower lifeboats, are designed to work on a level ship. At 20 degrees, the boats hung uselessly, swinging in their cradles. Only the starboard lifeboats were operational. The Concordia carried 26 lifeboats, each rated for 150 people. Total capacity, 3,900 people. With only 13 starboard boats usable, capacity dropped to 1,950. There were 4,243 people still aboard. The crew, to their credit, did not wait for orders. Many crew members, seeing the list, began loading lifeboats at 10:30 p.m., 24 minutes before the official order. This unauthorized initiative saved lives. Passengers were guided to starboard muster stations. The muster stations were identified by letters. Each passenger's key card, the card that opened their cabin, had a letter printed on it. That letter indicated which lifeboat station they were assigned to. But many passengers had not attended the muster drill, which had been scheduled for the next day. They did not know what the letter meant. They did not know where to go. Crew members, many of whom spoke limited English, tried to guide them. Confusion compounded fear. Lifeboat stations on a cruise ship are located on specific decks, accessed by specific staircases. On the Concordia, most lifeboat embarkation points were on deck 4. Passengers in cabins on deck 2 or 3 had to climb stairs. Passengers in cabins on deck 9 or 10 had to descend. Elderly passengers, passengers with mobility issues, passengers with small children, struggled. The staircases were crowded. The ship was tilting. People fell. A woman from Germany, 78 years old, traveling alone, fell on a staircase between deck 6 and deck 5. She broke her hip. 2 crew members carried her the rest of the way. She survived, was evacuated on one of the last lifeboats, spent 4 months recovering in a hospital in Tuscany. She never sailed again. The lifeboats themselves are enclosed capsules, fiberglass shells with benches inside, small windows, a diesel engine for propulsion once in the water. They are designed to be unsinkable, to protect occupants from fire and weather. They are also claustrophobic. 150 people crammed into a space the size of a small bus. The boats are loaded from a deck-level door, passengers stepping across a small gap into the boat. When the ship is level, this is simple. When the ship is listing 20 degrees, the gap becomes a chasm. The boat hangs outward, away from the ship. Passengers had to step across empty space, with dark water below. Crew members held their hands, guided them. Some passengers refused. They froze at the threshold, terrified. Crew members pushed them. Gently at first, then harder. There was no time for coaxing. One lifeboat, number 8, was loaded with approximately 130 people. The boat's capacity was 150, but the crew member in charge, a Filipino able seaman, decided 130 was enough given the conditions. He sealed the door and signaled to lower. The davit mechanism engaged. The boat descended jerkily, swaying toward the water 20 meters below. Halfway down, the boat stuck. One of the davit cables had tangled. The boat hung, suspended, swinging. Passengers inside screamed. The crew member inside the boat had a radio. He called the deck crew. They tried to untangle the cable. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of hanging in the air, the ship looming above, the sea below. Finally, the cable freed. The boat dropped the remaining 10 meters faster than designed, hit the water hard. Passengers inside were thrown against the benches. One man broke his collarbone. The boat's engine started. They motored away from the ship toward the lights of Giglio. By 11 p.m., the list had reached 25 degrees. At this angle, the port side of the ship was nearly 40 meters higher than the starboard side. Passengers still inside, trying to reach muster stations, found themselves climbing what were effectively walls. Carpeted corridors became climbing routes. Handrails, installed vertically on walls, were now horizontal. People used them to pull themselves upward. The elegant atrium, the capitol, became a surreal landscape. The marble floor was a slope. The grand staircase on the port side was unusable, too steep. The starboard staircase was crowded with people hauling themselves upward, hand over hand. The glass elevators hung motionless in their shafts, empty, lit by emergency lights, monuments to a technology now useless. In the cabins, the tilt made movement nearly impossible. Furniture slid. A passenger from Italy, a man named Giovanni, later described returning to his cabin to retrieve his medication. The door, which opened inward, now required him to pull it uphill. Inside, the bed had slid across the room and wedged against the bathroom door. His suitcase had tumbled and spilled. He found his medication on the floor, now the wall, grabbed it, and left. He never saw that cabin again. The ship was declared a total loss. Everything inside, every suitcase, every piece of jewelry, every laptop was abandoned. The crew's cabins, below the waterline, flooded first. Crew members had no time to retrieve personal belongings. A housekeeper from Honduras, a woman who had worked on the Concordia for 8 months, lost everything. Her wages, which she sent home to her family, were paid by direct deposit, so the money was safe. But her photographs, letters from her daughter, a necklace her mother had given her, all gone, submerged, irretrievable. She was evacuated on Lifeboat 14. She was wearing her uniform, black trousers and a white blouse, no jacket. The January night was cold. A passenger gave her a sweater. She wore it for 2 days until relief supplies arrived on Giglio. The ship's officers, following maritime protocol, were supposed to be the last to leave. The captain, by tradition and by law, is the last person off a sinking ship. This tradition is not sentimental. It is practical. The captain has the most knowledge of the ship's systems, the best ability to coordinate rescue, the authority to make life and death decisions. The captain stays because the captain is needed. Francesco Schettino left the ship at approximately 11:30 p.m. The evacuation was not complete. Hundreds of passengers were still aboard. Schettino later claimed he fell into a lifeboat accidentally, that he was coordinating the evacuation from the deck, and the boat was being lowered, and he tripped and fell into it. No one who heard this explanation believed it. The boat was lowered. Schettino was inside. He was rowed to Giglio. He stepped onto the dock. He was safe. At 11:47 p.m., Sares, a Coast Guard officer in Livorno, Captain Gregorio De Falco, was monitoring radio transmissions from the Concordia. He heard reports that the captain was no longer aboard. DeFalco called Schettino directly on his cell phone. The conversation was recorded. It has since been played in courtrooms, in documentaries, in news reports. DeFalco asked Schettino where he was. Schettino said he was coordinating the rescue from a lifeboat. DeFalco asked if he was still aboard the ship. Schettino said no. DeFalco, audibly angry, ordered Schettino to return to the ship. Vada a bordo, cazzo! Go back on board, damn it! Schettino refused. He said it was dark, the ship was listing too much, it was too dangerous. DeFalco repeated the order. Schettino did not comply. He remained on Giglio. He commandeered a small room in the harbor office. He made phone calls. He did not return to his ship. On board, without the captain, the evacuation continued under the direction of the staff captain and the hotel director. Crew members, many of them young, in their 20s, with limited training, made decisions that saved lives. A waiter from Indonesia carried an elderly woman with a broken leg down 3 decks to a lifeboat. A bartender from Italy organized a group of passengers into a human chain to pass children across the gap into a lifeboat. A dancer from the theater, still in her costume, a sequined dress and heels, helped passengers put on life jackets, tying the straps because their hands were shaking too badly to do it themselves. She lost her shoes somewhere in the chaos, evacuated barefoot. These acts, small and large, are rarely detailed in official reports. They are mentioned in survivor accounts, in interviews, in thank you letters written months later. Heroism is common in disasters. It simply does not make as compelling a headline as cowardice. By midnight, the ship had rolled to 30 degrees. At this angle, the starboard side was partially out of the water. The hull, normally submerged, was exposed, barnacles and anti-fouling paint visible in the searchlights from Coast Guard boats. The port side was submerged to deck 5. Water had entered passenger corridors on decks 3 and 4. Cabins on those decks were flooded. Anyone still inside those cabins drowned. The official investigation later identified 4 people who died in their cabins, unable to escape. One was an elderly man with a heart condition, traveling with his wife. She had gone to the muster station. He had stayed behind, saying he needed to rest, that he would come in a moment. She never saw him again. His body was found in their cabin 6 weeks later, when divers finally reached that section of the ship. The island of Giglio has a population of approximately 1,200 people in winter. Most are fishermen, shopkeepers, hoteliers waiting for summer tourists. The island has 1 doctor, 1 pharmacy, 1 small clinic with 6 beds. It has a volunteer fire brigade, no police force beyond a single carabinier who handles administrative matters. It is not equipped to handle a maritime disaster. At 11:20 p.m., on January 13th, 2012, Giglio's mayor, Sergio Ortelli, received a phone call from the Coast Guard informing him that a cruise ship had run aground off his island and was evacuating passengers. Ortelli asked how many passengers. The Coast Guard said over 4,000. Ortelli, standing in his kitchen in his pajamas, looked out his window at his small town and understood immediately that this was impossible. He had 1,200 residents. He did not have beds for 4,000 people. He did not have food for 4,000 people. He did not have a dock large enough to receive 4,000 people. But he also understood that impossible is not an option when people are dying in cold water 300 meters from your shore. Ortelli called everyone. The priest, the school principal, the owner of the island's largest hotel, the captain of the fishing cooperative. Within 20 minutes, the church of San Pietro was opened and its heating turned on. The school gymnasium was unlocked. The parish hall, normally used for wedding receptions and town meetings, became a triage center. Residents brought blankets from their homes, towels, dry clothing. The island's 3 restaurants, closed for the season, were reopened. Kitchens fired up. Pasta was boiled in industrial quantities. Coffee was brewed. The island's 2 bakeries began baking bread at midnight. No one asked who would pay for this. No one sent invoices. The people of Giglio simply did what needed to be done. The first lifeboats arrived at Giglio's harbor at 11:35 p.m. Passengers stumbled out, shaking, some weeping, some silent with shock. They wore life jackets over evening gowns, over pajamas, over nothing. One woman was barefoot, in a cocktail dress, her makeup smeared. A man carried a child who was not his own, could not remember where he had found the child, handed the child to a volunteer, and then sat down on the pavement and put his head in his hands. The volunteers, islanders in coats pulled over sleepwear, guided passengers towards the church. Inside, pews were pushed aside. Blankets were distributed. A woman from the island, a school teacher, moved through the crowd with a notepad, writing down names, nationalities, cabin numbers, trying to create a list of who had survived, who was missing. It was chaos organized by decency. The fishing boats of Giglio, small wooden vessels used for catching octopus and sea bass, motored out towards the Concordia. The ship lay on its side now, a mountain of white steel lit by emergency lights and the searchlights of Coast Guard helicopters. The fishermen could see people on the exposed hull, standing on the starboard side, which was now nearly horizontal, waving, shouting. The fishermen brought their boats close as they dared. The water was full of debris, deck chairs, life rings, pieces of fiberglass from damaged lifeboats. One fisherman, a man named Giancarlo, maneuvered his boat directly under a section of the hull where a group of passengers had climbed out onto the exterior. He shouted up to them. They shouted back in languages he did not understand. He gestured. They understood. One by one, they lowered themselves down, hanging from railings, dropping the last 2 meters into his boat. He pulled 11 people from the hull that night. His boat was rated for 4 passengers. With 11 survivors aboard, the boat rode low in the water, but it made it back to shore. Giancarlo made 3 trips, 33 people in total. He refused payment, refused interviews, refused recognition. When journalists found him weeks later, he said he had done what anyone would do. This was not true. What he did required courage and skill. But humility is common among those who perform extraordinary acts. By 1 a.m. on January 14th, most of the lifeboats had been launched. Approximately 3,800 people had evacuated via lifeboat or been rescued by fishing boats and Coast Guard vessels. Approximately 400 people remained on the ship. Some were crew, staying to assist. Some were passengers unable to reach the lifeboat decks due to injury, age, or fear. Some were passengers trapped in sections of the ship now inaccessible due to the list and flooding. The Coast Guard helicopters, 2 of them, began winching operations. A helicopter would hover over the exposed hull, lower a rescue swimmer on a cable. The swimmer would harness a passenger, and the winch would pull them up. Each lift took 4 to 6 minutes. The helicopters could carry 6 passengers per trip, then had to fly to shore to offload, then return. It was slow. It was dangerous. The ship was still moving, settling, groaning. Metal screamed as bulkheads buckled under stress. The helicopter's pilots, flying in darkness, in rotor wash that made the sea below churn, performed extractions that are studied now in rescue training programs. Not a single person was dropped. Not a single winch cable failed. Among those still aboard at 1:30 a.m. was a crew member named Russell Rebello. He was a waiter, 26 years old, from India. He had been working in one of the restaurants when the impact occurred. He had helped passengers to lifeboats. When his supervisor told him to evacuate, he refused. He said there were still passengers in the corridors on deck 4, elderly passengers who could not climb. He went back inside. He was last seen entering a flooded corridor, moving towards the sound of someone calling for help. His body was recovered in August of 2014, more than 2 years later, when the ship was finally raised and moved. He was found in a corridor on deck 4, still in his waiter's uniform. He had drowned trying to reach someone. The someone was never identified. Russell Rebello's family, his parents in India, received a letter from the Italian government posthumously awarding him a medal for civil valor. The medal sits in a frame in his parents' home. It does not compensate for the loss, but it acknowledges the truth. He did not have to go back inside. By 2 a.m., the ship had rolled to approximately 65 degrees. It was lying almost on its side, the port rail submerged, the starboard rail 50 meters above the waterline. The upper decks, now vertical, looked like the wall of a building. The funnel, painted bright yellow with the blue Costa logo, stuck out horizontally over the water. Passengers still aboard had climbed to the highest accessible point, the starboard side open decks, and waited for helicopters. Some used their cell phones to call family, to say they were alive, to say they were waiting. One man, a manager from Germany, called his wife and described what he saw. The sea below, calm and black. The island's lights, the helicopters circling. He told her he loved her. She told him to hold on. He held on. He was winched off the ship at 3:15 a.m. He had been standing on the hull for over 4 hours, in January cold, wearing a suit jacket and life jacket. When he reached the helicopter, he could not feel his fingers. The medic wrapped him in a thermal blanket. He wept, not from fear, but from relief so overwhelming it had no other outlet. The last passengers were evacuated at approximately 4:30 a.m. on January 14th. The final count of evacuees was 4,229. 32 people were unaccounted for. Some of those 32 were in the water, drowned, their bodies not yet found. Some were inside the ship, trapped in flooded cabins or corridors. Search and rescue operations continued for days, then weeks. Divers from the Italian Coast Guard and Navy entered the wreck, moving through dark, flooded spaces, searching. It is difficult to convey the horror of this work. The ship's interior, which had been a luxury hotel, was now a submerged labyrinth. Corridors were sideways. Doors opened onto walls. Furniture floated. The water was murky with diesel fuel, sewage, debris. Visibility was less than a meter. Divers worked by touch, moving room to room, opening doors, feeling for bodies. They found 15 bodies inside the ship in the first week. The other 17 were found over the following months, some during the salvage operation in 2013 and 14. Among the dead was a 5-year-old girl named Diana Arlotti. She had been traveling with her father, William Arlotti. They had been separated during the evacuation. William searched for her, calling her name, moving through the tilting corridors. He could not find her. He was forced to evacuate. He reached shore and immediately began asking everyone if they had seen a small girl, 5 years old, curly hair, pink jacket. No one had. William returned to the ship with a Coast Guard team that night, searching. He found her body in a flooded corridor on deck 4 the next morning. She had drowned, likely quickly. William carried her out himself. The image of a father carrying his drowned daughter from a capsized cruise ship is one that stays in the mind. It is useful to remember, when discussing lawsuits and criminal trials and insurance payouts, that this happened. A father carried his daughter's body out of a ship that should never have been near those rocks. The official death toll was 32. 27 passengers, 5 crew. They ranged in age from 5 to 82. 13 were Italian, 6 were German, 6 were French. There was 1 victim each from Hungary, India, Peru, South Korea, and Spain. Each death was investigated. Each had a cause: drowning, hypothermia, blunt force trauma from falling or being struck by debris. One man, a 70-year-old from France, died of a heart attack, likely brought on by stress and exertion. His wife, who survived, said he had a pre-existing heart condition, but had been cleared by his doctor to travel. The shock of the evacuation, the climbing, the cold, was too much. He collapsed on deck 5 and died before medics could reach him. His body was evacuated with the living, placed in a lifeboat, covered with a blanket. His wife sat beside him during the boat ride to shore. She held his hand. He was already gone. The wreck of the Concordia, lying on its side in 20 meters of water, 300 meters from Giglio's shore, became immediately a problem. It was not just a shipwreck. It was a container of pollutants. The ship held 2,400 tons of fuel oil in its tanks. It held lubricants, hydraulic fluids, sewage, chemicals from the photo lab, the dry cleaning facility, the pool treatment systems. If the fuel tanks ruptured, 2,400 tons of heavy fuel oil would spread across a protected marine area. Giglio is part of the Tuscan Archipelago National Park. The waters are a sanctuary for dolphins, sea turtles, monk seals. An oil spill would be catastrophic. Within 48 hours of the grounding, salvage experts and environmental engineers arrived from across Europe. Booms, floating barriers were deployed around the wreck to contain any leaks. Pumps were brought in to begin extracting fuel. This operation, called defueling, took 6 weeks. Divers descended into the wreck, located the fuel tanks, drilled access holes, and pumped the oil into barges. It was dangerous work. The ship was unstable, still settling. Divers worked in flooded, pitch-black engine rooms surrounded by jagged metal. One diver was injured when a bulkhead collapsed. He survived, was airlifted to a hospital in Grosseto, recovered. The defueling was completed in March of 2012. 2,380 tons of fuel were removed. 120 tons had already leaked. The oil created a sheen on the water, visible from the air, a rainbow slick that dispersed slowly. Environmental impact studies conducted later found elevated hydrocarbon levels in sediment near the wreck, damage to seagrass beds, but not the wholesale destruction that had been feared. The defueling operation, dangerous and expensive, had worked. The question of what to do with the wreck itself took longer to answer. The ship could not remain where it was. It was a navigational hazard, an environmental risk, and a grotesque monument to negligence visible from every point on Giglio. But removing a 100,000-ton ship lying on its side in shallow water is not a simple matter. No one had ever successfully removed a ship this large from such a position. The traditional method, cutting the ship into pieces and hauling them away, would take years and risk further environmental damage. A different approach was proposed. The ship would be rotated upright, refloated, and towed away whole. This operation, called parbuckling, had been used on smaller vessels, but never on anything the size of the Concordia. Engineers from around the world were consulted. Simulations were run. Scale models were built and tested. The consensus was that it could be done, but it would be extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily expensive, and extraordinarily risky. The salvage was awarded to a consortium led by an Italian firm, Titan Salvage, in partnership with an American company, Mecoperi. The cost was estimated at 300 million euros. The actual cost, by the time the operation concluded, was closer to 900 million euros. Work began in May of 2012. First, the wreck had to be stabilized. Steel sponsons, large hollow boxes, were welded to the starboard side, the side that was out of the water. These sponsons would provide buoyancy when the ship was rotated. A platform was constructed on the seabed, a base to support the wreck during the operation. Cables were attached to the port side, the submerged side, running to anchor points drilled into the granite seabed. Hydraulic jacks were installed on the sponsons. The plan was to use the jacks and cables to slowly rotate the ship upright, a process expected to take 12 to 18 hours. The parbuckling operation began on September 16, 2013, 20 months after the grounding. It was broadcast live on Italian television. Engineers, government officials, environmentalists, and journalists watched from boats and from the shore. The jacks engaged. The cables tightened. The ship, slowly, began to move. It rotated at a rate of approximately 1 degree every 30 minutes. The groaning of the metal could be heard across the water, a deep, resonant sound like a whale singing. By nightfall, the ship had rotated 15 degrees. By the next morning, it was upright, or nearly so, resting on the seabed platform. The operation had taken 19 hours. It was declared a success. The ship, though battered, though gutted, though stained with rust and algae, was no longer lying on its side. It floated barely, held up by the sponsons and the platform. The ship remained at Giglio for another 9 months, while additional sponsons were attached, and internal compartments were sealed to make the hull watertight enough for towing. During this time, the search for the remaining bodies continued. 2 victims were still missing. Their bodies were found in June of 2014, during the final preparation for refloating. One was a crew member, an Indian man who had been working in the engine room. The other was a passenger, an Italian woman, elderly, who had likely been in her cabin when the ship capsized. Both bodies were badly decomposed, identified by personal effects and dental records. With their recovery, the death toll was confirmed. 32 dead, all accounted for. On July 23, 2014, the Concordia was refloated and began the journey to Genoa, where it would be scrapped. The ship was towed by tugboats, moving at a speed of 2 knots, roughly 3.5 kilometers per hour. The journey took 4 days. As the wreck passed along the Italian coast, people gathered on beaches to watch. It was a spectacle, morbid and fascinating. The ship, once a symbol of leisure and luxury, was now a rusted hulk. Its hull covered in barnacles. Its superstructure collapsed in places. Windows shattered. Balconies twisted. The contrast with the glossy promotional photos from 2006 was stark. Those photos showed a gleaming white ship under blue skies, passengers smiling, the sea calm. The reality in July 2014 was grey steel, cloudy skies, and a thing that had died being hauled to its dismantling. The Concordia arrived in Genoa on July 27, 2014. It was moored at a dismantling facility in the port. Over the next 2 years, the ship was taken apart. Workers cut through the hull with torches, removed furniture, fixtures, machinery, miles of cable, tons of glass and steel. Everything was sorted. Metal was melted down and sold. Furniture that could be salvaged was auctioned, though there was little demand for chairs and tables from a ship where people had died. Most of it was destroyed. By 2017, the Concordia no longer existed as a physical object. It had been reduced to raw materials, recycled, repurposed, erased. But the ship's ghost remained in the courts, in the media, in the memories of survivors. Captain Francesco Schettino was arrested on January 14, 2012, hours after the evacuation. He was charged with manslaughter, causing a shipwreck, and abandoning ship. His trial began in July of 2013 and lasted 2 years. The proceedings were exhaustive. Hundreds of witnesses testified. Survivors described the chaos, the delays, the fear. Crew members described Schettino's decisions on the bridge, his order to sail close to Giglio, his failure to sound the alarm, his departure from the ship. Technical experts presented analysis of the ship's course, the impact, the flooding. Schettino's defense argued that he had been made a scapegoat, that the ship's owners, Costa Concordia, and the classification society that had certified the ship as safe bore responsibility as well. This argument had merit. Costa Concordia had a history of captains performing unauthorized salutes. The company had never disciplined anyone for it. The implication was that such maneuvers were tolerated, even encouraged, as a form of marketing. But the law is less interested in corporate culture than in individual actions. Schettino had turned the ship toward the rocks. Schettino had delayed the evacuation. Schettino had abandoned his ship. On February 11, 2015, Schettino was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. The sentence was upheld on appeal. Schettino began serving his sentence in May of 2017. He is currently incarcerated in Rome. He will be eligible for parole in 2029, when he is 69 years old. He maintains that he is not solely responsible, that others should have been held accountable. He is correct that others bear responsibility. Costa Concordia paid fines and settled lawsuits totaling over 100 million euros. But no other individual was prosecuted. Schettino is the only person in prison for the deaths of 32 people. The media arrived on Giglio before the sun rose on January 14, 2012. Helicopters carrying camera crews hovered over the wreck, filming the exposed hull, the tiny figures of survivors still clinging to the railings. Satellite trucks parked in the island's small square, cables running into the church where survivors huddled under blankets. Journalists, equipped with telephoto lenses and translation apps, moved through the crowd asking questions. Some survivors spoke, others turned away. A French woman, still wearing her sequined evening gown under a borrowed coat, described walking on the walls of corridors, climbing stairs that had become ladders. An Italian man, a retired engineer, explained in precise detail how the ship's list had made evacuation nearly impossible on one side. His calm, technical description, delivered while his hands shook holding a paper cup of coffee, was broadcast on RAI, Italy's national network, and replayed for days. By noon on the 14th, the story was international. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, every major network carried footage of the Concordia lying on its side, the massive hull a white wall rising from the sea. The images were striking. A ship that size is not supposed to capsize. Ships that size are supposed to be safe, unsinkable in the collective imagination, even though the word unsinkable was retired after the Titanic. The Concordia's failure violated the implicit contract of modern travel, that technology, regulation, and expertise would protect passengers from disaster. The violation was made worse by the details that emerged quickly. The ship had not struck a reef in a storm. The sea had been calm. The ship had not suffered mechanical failure. The engines had been functioning. The ship had been deliberately steered off course toward known hazards for the purpose of showing off. And the captain had abandoned ship while passengers drowned. These facts, reported within 24 hours, transformed the story from tragedy to scandal. Captain Schettino's face was on front pages worldwide by January 15th. Italian newspapers called him Captain Coward. The Daily Mail in Britain ran a headline, "The Captain Who Fled." The New York Times published a timeline showing that Schettino had left the ship more than 3 hours before the last passenger was evacuated. The audio recording of Coast Guard Captain Gregorio De Falco ordering Schettino back aboard, "Vada a bordo, cazzo!" Beast, was played on television, on radio, posted online. It became, briefly, a meme. The phrase was printed on t-shirts, turned into remixes, referenced in comedy sketches. This trivialization was obscene, given that 32 people were dead. But the internet does not pause for decency. Schettino himself gave an interview to an Italian television station on January 16th, 2 days after the disaster. He appeared drawn, unshaven, wearing a rumpled shirt. He claimed he had not abandoned ship, but had been organizing the rescue from the lifeboat. He claimed he had fallen into the lifeboat by accident. He claimed the rocks were not on his charts, which was a lie. They were clearly marked. He claimed he had saved lives by steering the ship toward shore, which was partially true, but ignored the fact that he had caused the disaster in the first place. The interview was a catastrophe. His tone was defensive, self-pitying. He showed no visible emotion when asked about the dead. Public opinion, already against him, hardened into contempt. In the court of public perception, Schettino was convicted within a week. But Schettino, contemptible as he was not the only person at fault. Costa Concordia, the company that owned the Concordia, had a corporate culture that encouraged risk. Captains were under pressure to maintain schedules, to keep passengers entertained, to generate positive word of mouth. Ship salutes, the practice of sailing close to shore to impress onlookers, were common on Costa vessels. Documents revealed during the trial showed that Costa executives knew about these salutes and did not prohibit them. In fact, some internal emails suggested that salutes were seen as good marketing, opportunities for spectacular photos that could be used in brochures. The company's safety management system, certified by an independent classification society, was supposed to prevent unauthorized deviations from planned routes. It did not. Schettino had performed salutes before. He had never been disciplined. Costa Crociere is a subsidiary of Carnival Corporation, the largest cruise company in the world. Carnival is based in Miami, incorporated in Panama for tax purposes, and operates over 100 ships under various brand names. It is a publicly traded company with annual revenues exceeding $20 billion. The Concordia disaster was, for Carnival, a financial and reputational blow, but not an existential threat. The company's stock price dropped 14% in the week following the disaster, then recovered within 6 months. Carnival set aside $300 million to cover immediate costs, passenger compensation, legal fees, environmental cleanup. This sum was later increased to $1.1 billion as lawsuits multiplied and the salvage costs escalated. $1.1 billion is a significant amount, but Carnival's annual profit in 2012 was still over $1.3 billion. The company survived. The passengers and crew, economically speaking, did not fare as well. Costa Crociere offered survivors an immediate payment of €11,000 per passenger as compensation for trauma, lost belongings, and the interrupted cruise. Many survivors rejected the offer. They filed lawsuits in Italian courts, in their home countries, in the United States. The lawsuits argued that Costa had been negligent in hiring Schettino, in failing to enforce safety protocols, in delaying the evacuation order. Most of these lawsuits were settled out of court. Settlement amounts were confidential, but legal experts estimate that passengers who pursued litigation received between €30,000 and €100,000 each, depending on the severity of injury and the quality of their legal representation. Families of the deceased received larger settlements, reportedly between €1 and €3 million per death. These sums, while substantial to individuals, are rounding errors in Carnival Corporation's accounting. The crew members, many of whom had lost their jobs when the Concordia was destroyed, received less. Costa Crociere initially offered crew members 3 months' severance pay. The International Transport Workers Federation, a union representing maritime workers, intervened and negotiated for 6 months' pay plus assistance in finding new employment. Even so, crew members from developing countries, Filipinos, Indonesians, Indians, who had relied on their cruise ship wages to support families, faced months of unemployment. One crew member, a Filipino waiter interviewed by a Manila newspaper, said he had been sending $700 a month to his family. He lost his job, received $4,000 in severance, and was unemployed for 11 months before finding work on another ship. His family in that time fell behind on rent, pulled his daughter out of private school, sold their motorbike. The economic ripple of a disaster extends far beyond the immediate victims. Giglio, the island that had opened its doors to 4,000 strangers in the middle of the night, also suffered economically. The island's economy depends on tourism. In summer, the population swells to 15,000 as vacationers arrive to enjoy the beaches, the hiking, the clear water. But after January 2012, Giglio was known not for beauty, but for the shipwreck. The hulk of the Concordia, lying on its side 300 meters offshore, was visible from the island's main beach, from the harbor, from the hiking trails. It dominated the view. Tour operators reported a 30% drop in bookings for summer 2012. Hotels that were usually full in July had vacancies. Restaurants that relied on tourist traffic saw revenues decline. The island's mayor, Sergio Ortelli, estimated that the wreck cost Giglio's economy approximately 10 million euros per year in lost tourism. The salvage operation, which brought workers and engineers to the island, provided some economic compensation, but it was temporary. When the wreck was finally removed in 2014, there was relief, but also the recognition that the island's reputation had been damaged in ways that a balance sheet cannot capture. The environmental impact, carefully monitored during and after the disaster, was less severe than feared, but not negligible. The fuel spill, 120 tons of heavy oil, dissipated within weeks due to wave action and natural breakdown. Hydrocarbon levels in the water returned to normal within 6 months. However, the seabed where the ship had lain was scarred. The wreck had crushed seagrass meadows, destroyed coral formations, displaced marine life. Biologists from the University of Siena conducted surveys and found that biodiversity within a 100-meter radius of the wreck had decreased by 40%. Recovery, they estimated, would take 10 to 15 years. By 2020, 8 years after the disaster, follow-up studies showed that seagrass had begun to recolonize the area and fish populations were rebounding. The sea, given time, heals. But the healing is slow. The legal proceedings against Schettino were exhaustive and public. The trial, held in a courthouse in Grosseto, a town on the Tuscan coast, lasted from July 2013 to February 2015. Over 400 witnesses testified. Survivors recounted the night in painful detail. Crew members described the decisions made on the bridge. Technical experts presented simulations of the ship's course, showing frame by frame how Schettino had steered toward the reef. Audio recordings from the bridge were played in court. In one recording, made minutes after the impact, Schettino can be heard telling a Coast Guard officer that the ship had suffered a blackout but was fine. In another, made an hour later, he is arguing with his staff captain about whether to give the abandoned ship order. The staff captain, audibly frustrated, says, "Captain, we are sinking." Schettino replies, I know, but we need to be sure." The delay, prosecutors argued, cost lives. If the evacuation had been ordered immediately, passengers would have had more time, the ship would have been more stable, the lifeboats easier to launch. Schettino's defense attorneys argued that he was being scapegoated, that systemic failures within Costa Concordia had created the conditions for disaster. They pointed out that the company had known about previous unauthorized salutes and had done nothing. They argued that the ship's bridge crew, 5 officers present at the time of the grounding, had not objected to the course change, suggesting a culture where such maneuvers were normalized. They argued that the ship's safety management system, which was supposed to require approval for route deviations, had failed. These arguments were legally coherent. They were also insufficient. Italian maritime law holds the captain responsible for the safety of the ship and all aboard. The captain has ultimate authority and ultimate responsibility. Schettino, by ordering the course change, by delaying evacuation, by leaving the ship, had violated his duties. The court found him guilty. The sentence, 16 years, was severe by Italian standards for manslaughter. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted that Schettino's actions were not merely negligent, but reckless, that he had prioritized spectacle over safety, and that his abandonment of the ship represented a profound moral failure. The families of the victims, many of whom attended the trial, expressed relief at the verdict. One woman, whose daughter had drowned in her cabin, told reporters, "It does not bring her back, but it is justice." Another family, parents of a young crew member who had died helping passengers, said the sentence was appropriate, but that it should not obscure the heroism of others. This distinction is important. In focusing on Schettino's cowardice, the narrative sometimes overshadowed the bravery of crew members who stayed, who helped, who died doing their jobs. The changes made to cruise industry safety protocols after the Concordia were significant, but came too late for the 32 dead. Within 6 months of the disaster, international maritime regulations were amended to require that passenger muster drills be conducted before a ship leaves port, not after. Previously, ships had up to 24 hours after departure to conduct drills. The new rule, enforced by the International Maritime Organization, mandates that all passengers must attend a muster drill and physically go to their assigned lifeboat station before the ship sails. This change alone likely prevents deaths in future emergencies. Passengers who know where to go and how to get there are more likely to survive. Bridge resource management. The protocols governing how decisions are made on a ship's bridge was also scrutinized. The Concordia's bridge crew had been passive, deferring to Schettino even when his decisions were clearly dangerous. New training programs emphasized that junior officers have a duty to speak up, to question, to challenge a captain's orders if they believe those orders are unsafe. This cultural shift, from hierarchical obedience to collaborative decision-making, is difficult to implement. The captain remains the ultimate authority, but that authority is no longer absolute in practice. Simulator training for cruise ship officers now includes scenarios where the captain gives a dangerous order and the trainee must decide whether to comply or object. The correct answer in these simulations is always to object. Whether this training translates to real-world behavior in a crisis remains an open question. Ship design also changed. The Concordia's hull, while meeting all regulatory standards in 2006, was found to be vulnerable. The impact with the reef tore through multiple watertight compartments because the hull plating in that area was relatively thin, designed to save weight and cost. Post-Concordia, classification societies increased the required thickness of hull plating in the lower sections of cruise ships. Watertight doors, which are supposed to prevent flooding from spreading, were found to have failed on the Concordia. Some doors did not seal properly due to debris or damage. New regulations require redundant sealing mechanisms and more frequent testing. These changes, incremental and technical, make future ships marginally safer. They do not eliminate risk. Ships will always be vulnerable to human error. The Concordia disaster also prompted questions about the size of cruise ships. At 114,000 tons, the Concordia was large, but not the largest. As of 2024, the largest cruise ships exceed 230,000 tons and carry over 6,000 passengers. These floating cities are increasingly difficult to evacuate in an emergency. Lifeboat drills on a ship with 6,000 passengers take hours. The logistics of evacuating such a vessel, especially if it is listing or on fire, are daunting. Critics argue that the industry has prioritized scale and profit over safety, that ships have become too large to be managed safely in a crisis. The industry responds that modern ships have multiple redundant safety systems, that the probability of a Concordia-scale disaster is extremely low, and that millions of passengers cruise safely every year. Both positions are true. The ships are safer than ever. They are also larger and more complex, which means that when something goes wrong, it can go very wrong. The memory of the Concordia lives on in multiple forms. In Giglio, a small memorial was erected near the harbor. It consists of 32 bronze dolphins, one for each victim, mounted on a granite stone. The inscription reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives, and in gratitude to those who saved them." The memorial is simple, dignified. Tourists visit it, take photographs, leave flowers. The island has moved on, economically and emotionally, but the memory remains. Survivors have organized into associations, groups that meet annually to remember, to share experiences, to support one another. Post-traumatic stress among Concordia survivors is well documented. Studies conducted by psychologists in Italy found that over 40% of survivors exhibited symptoms of PTSD in the year following the disaster. Nightmares, anxiety, hypervigilance, avoidance of water. For some, the symptoms faded. For others, they persist. One survivor, a woman from Germany, said in an interview in 2020 that she still cannot board a ship, not even a ferry, without panic. She described the sensation of the floor tilting, the sound of water rushing, as visceral memories that return unbidden. Trauma does not follow a timeline, it lingers. The ship itself, dismantled and recycled, is physically gone, but exists extensively in documentary form. Thousands of hours of video were recorded during the disaster, the salvage, the trial. Documentaries have been produced by National Geographic, the BBC, Italian state television. These films, some tasteful, some sensationalist, have been watched by millions. The Concordia has become a case study in engineering programs, in maritime academies, in business schools. Students analyze what went wrong, how it could have been prevented, what lessons can be extracted. The disaster is educational material now, stripped of its human particulars, reduced to data points and flowcharts. This is not necessarily wrong. Learning from failure is how systems improve. But it is worth remembering, when watching a documentary or reading a case study, that 32 people died, that 4,000 people were traumatized, that families were destroyed. Francesco Schettino, inmate in a Roman prison, has become a symbol. He represents the hubris of authority, the failure of responsibility, the ease with which a single person's poor judgment can cascade into mass tragedy. He is not alone in history in this role. Captains who have caused disasters through negligence or incompetence are a recurring archetype. But Schettino's case is particularly stark because the negligence was so avoidable, the deviation so unnecessary, the abandonment so indefensible. He is serving his sentence. He will likely serve most of it. When he is released, if he is released, he will be in his 70s, unemployable, infamous. His name is synonymous with cowardice. This is his legacy. The Concordia's legacy is more complex. The ship was a product of ambition, of the cruise industry's drive to build larger, more luxurious, more profitable vessels. She was beautiful in her way. Passengers who sailed on her before the disaster remember the atrium's grandeur, the quality of the meals, the entertain.